Our next unit is on chemical nomenclature, which is just a fancy way of saying naming and writing formulas for chemical compounds. Nomenclature is a naming system, and this is Chapter 9. First, let's talk about what exactly a compound is. Now, back in our first unit, we talked about how chemistry was the study of the composition of matter. And we talked about the types of matter that exist. And we talked about specifically pure substances and mixtures. Of the pure substances, they could be classified as either elements or compounds. So this unit is on naming those compounds and writing their formulas. A compound is a substance composed of two or more elements that's held together by a chemical bond. A chemical bond is sort of like the glue that holds atoms together in molecules or formula units. There happen to be three types of chemical bonds. There are ionic bonds, and covalent bonds, and metallic bonds. In this particular unit, we are going to focus on two of those three types of chemical bonds. We will be focusing on ionic and on covalent bonds. Let's define an ionic bond. Now, from the name ionic, you see ion. So we learned that ions form when an atom gains or loses electrons. Well, in an ionic bond, what is happening is electrons are transferred from the metal to the nonmetal. Remember, in the last unit, we learned that metals always form cations when they form an ion, and nonmetals always form anions when they form an ion. So an ionic bond is an electrostatic attraction between a metal ion, which is a positive ion, and a nonmetal ion, which is a negative ion. Remember, opposite charges attract. Now, ionic bonds are found in ionic compounds. The type of compound that you will find an ionic bond in is called an ionic compound. Ionic compounds are composed of a metal ion, which is known as a cation, and a nonmetal ion, which is known as an anion. Ionic bonds are the strongest types of bonds. Therefore, they have very high melting points and very high boiling points. Compounds that are ionic have extremely high melting points and boiling points. This is due, again, to the fact that this is a very strong bond. Ionic substances are always going to be crystalline solids at room temperature. Just think about it. One of the most common types of ionic compounds is sodium chloride or table salt. And if you think about what table salt's physical state is at room temperature, it is a white crystalline solid is what it's called. Some other examples of some ionic compounds besides sodium chloride are potassium chloride and magnesium chloride. You will notice in any ionic compound, the formula will start with a metal. Here we have a 1A metal. Here we have a 1A metal. Here we have a 2A metal. And it will end in a nonmetal. Here we have a halogen, chlorine, chlorine, chlorine. So if you have a metal bonded to a nonmetal, you will have an ionic compound. It will contain an ionic bond. That's the first type of bond. The second type of bond that we're going to study in this unit is called a covalent bond. Now let's look at the word covalent. So in the word, if you break it down, you have the prefix co. So think about it. If you are cooperating or cohabitating. You are working together. Valent refers to the valence electrons. Now, specifically in a covalent bond, the atoms are cooperating with their valence electrons. Remember, atoms are trying to become stable because they want to get a full octet of electrons. So in a covalent bond, a pair of electrons are shared or they're cooperating. Remember, if you cooperate, you are sharing or working together. So they are working together or sharing a pair of electrons, that would be two electrons, and they're shared between the nonmetals. Covalent bonds are found when you have a nonmetal bonded to a nonmetal. The types of compounds that contain covalent bonds are known as molecular compounds. We call them molecules. These compounds are composed of two or more nonmetals. So remember, we talked about ionics. They're consisting of a metal ion and a nonmetal ion. Thus, they're called ionic, a metal and a nonmetal. Covalent only contains nonmetals. There are no ions in a covalent bond. These are weaker bonds than the ionic bonds. Therefore, they have very low melting points, or generally low melting points, and low boiling points. Many of the compounds that contain covalent bonds are gases or liquids at room temperature, as opposed to the ionic compounds, which are stronger bonds. All of those are crystalline solids at room temperature. The state of matter of a compound is indicative or an indicator of the strength of the bond holding the molecules together. Some examples of some compounds that contain covalent bonds or some molecular compounds are carbon dioxide. Notice carbon is a nonmetal and the oxygens are also nonmetals. Again, carbon is a nonmetal here in C8H18 and hydrogen is a nonmetal. This is the formula for octane, the active ingredient in gasoline. And then finally, my third example is water, dihydrogen monoxide. We have a nonmetal and a nonmetal. So molecular compounds contain covalent bonds where they're sharing electrons. These are always going to be consistent of a nonmetal and a nonmetal.